Welcome to Idaho History, the show that digs up the most thought-provoking stories from Idaho's history. Here are your hosts, Jeff Wade and Mark Iverson.
That's right. This is Idaho History. I'm Jeff.
And I'm Mark Iverson.
Yes, sir. And we are kind of in the middle of talking about prostitution in Idaho.
A bit of the sex for hire, my son.
Yep. Or at least the history of such. So with that, I think let's go and cut the jibber jabber and get right back into the topic.
I agree.
But, back in Idaho City, like everywhere, prostitutes lived lives full of drink, and in many cases, they used opium. VD, venereal disease, was rampant, and abortions under the most primitive conditions occurred. Like I said, the coat hanger cure. The lower a working woman was on the class ladder, the lower her life expectancy was. This was especially true in the harsh conditions like Idaho City, Silver City, and Florence. Florence was it was like the second big gold rush in Idaho. So, of course, you have women coming here and they plied their trade. I was looking at the 1870 census, and in 1870, which is well after the main gold rush had ended in Florence, because it only lasted about a year and a half before all the easy to get to gold was taken out of the ground, and then they had to switch to like hard rock mining, which is a lot more difficult. But in 1870, Florence, which at one time was one of the most populous cities in the Pacific Northwest, was down to about 27 miners working. In addition to those 27 miners, the census lists one lady, and she was the town prostitute.
I bet she felt surrounded.
I bet she was busy.
Oh, yeah. In Idaho City in 1870, at the same time, you had 35 Chinese prostitutes with several thousand Chinese men. None of them, or three maybe, were married.
Right.
And they were rich merchants, right?
Yeah, because a lot of times the Chinese would come to the United States, leave their families behind in China, and come over here, work, send money back, and then hopefully someday return to China.
Yeah. If it was tough for white women, it was doubly hard for Chinese sex slaves, as I call them, because that's essentially what they were. Very little choice existed for them at all. So an Idaho World article from 1897 noted, a China woman came up from Boise City a few days ago and being pursued by her owner, took poison in preference to being taken back. Dr. Zimpf was called and saved her life. The brutal treatment of the owners of Chinese women has caused 2 or 3 to attempt suicide within the last 2 or 3 months. An example ought to be made of these brutes. In 1870, as I said, Boise County Census said 35 Chinese women lived in the basin, and all were prostitutes, serving those thousands and thousands of Chinese men. So imagine waking up and being forced to have sex with 65, and that's on the low end, people every day. Yeah. So these poor women died at a staggering rate of disease and neglect. So basically to the environs and of malnutrition about them. It was actually a law to beat your horse if you were against beating your horse back then. And Chinese men were given fines for this, but beat your prostitute, kill her. Nobody cared if they even knew she was there.
It was a lot like slavery in the South. They were viewed as property.
Yep, and that's what it was. But anyway, so there were times, and I didn't find this in Idaho, but I found this in other towns. There were a few cases where one of the practices was if a woman was dying of disease, or if they just didn't want to take care of her anymore, or perhaps she wasn't profitable, these owners, quote unquote, would put women inside this small space, the Chinese women, or a shed or cell, and they would give them a candle, and they would have the time it took for the candle to burn down. And if they hadn't killed themselves with poison or whatever else, other means that had been presented to them, they were murdered by their owners. And so it's one of those facts that make you kind of, myself, I speak to, loathe humanity.
Right. Yeah, definitely. However, I'd like to kind of throw things back to that, not all women would remain passive in the face of abuse. Mark, you remember a lady named Nettie Bowen?
Yes, I remember Nettie. She is one badass lady.
Yes, she is. So Nettie, I'm going to tell you a little story about Nettie from Nampa. Nettie from Nampa.
Nampa Nettie.
Nampa Nettie. That's a good one. So after Nettie worked and lived in Nampa for a while, she moved on to the big city, the city of trees. And she lived when I say lived, she lived and worked, probably, in a little crib, one of those back alley.
Yeah, from what I can tell, it could be a small shack attached to a building. It could be some small part inside the building. I mean, it could be a number of things.
Yeah, so definitely not a place you want to spend your time. So Nettie's crib was in one of the back alleys between Idaho and Main Streets. And on March 28th, 1892, a guy named Jimmy Turner, who would soon after this be a resident of the Masonic and Oddfellows Cemetery on Warm Springs Avenue, also known as Pioneer Cemetery today. So Jimmy Turner, he was a frequent client of Nettie's. And, he would get a little violent on occasion. So quite a few times he actually beat up Nettie. And on this occasion, she looks at old Jimmy and she says, "You're not going to do that again to me." And he did it again. Nettie actually reached under her garment, whipped out a knife, and started stabbing old Jimmy Turner in the arm and the leg, severely wounding him before the blade actually broke off while she was stabbing him. And it lodged itself deep into his flesh. The cops showed up, asked what was going on, saw old Jimmy Turner bleeding, probably almost to death at this point. But Jimmy was such an ass to the police that they just let Nettie go on her way. Later on in 1894, Jimmy ended up messing with the wrong person in the guise of a guy named Billy Gilbert, who was the owner of the Free Roll Saloon. Billy was known throughout the mining camps in Nevada and Utah for being quick with a gun. Jimmy Turner tried to pull a pistol on Turner, but he was shot lightning quick by Billy's .44. And like Nettie, Billy walked away with his freedom. And if you want to read the full story on that, Mark actually has a blog post on that on our website. I think it's called The Shootout at the Free Roll Saloon.
Yeah, or on Facebook, it's 2 slugs from a .44. Jimmy Turner is no more.
Yeah, we have both.
Whatever. I was trying to be all crafty, but I like the other one better. So, Jeff.
Yes.
If ever a man deserved getting shot, it was old Jimmy. Let me tell you.
Yes, I agree.
Yep. But let's move on to the 1890s to the 1920s. Some of this happened then that we just talked about, so it's a good transition point. But I think it is only fair to talk about the opportunist who fed off these soiled doves like so many vultures feeding upon a bloated buffalo carcass, if you will.
Yummy.
So first, let's start with pimps. But these pimps, right, they were burly men that sought out customers, right? And they would bring customers to the ladies, and they often provided protection. Sometimes they managed a few ladies themselves, but the lower down on the ladder you were as a prostitute, the more violent your pimp tended to be. So, but they weren't the big turds, right? They were kind of like your floaters, your little floaters. Mm-hmm. The big turds were the property owners and the building owners. So these illustrious citizens, were you could find in any town. And they were in Boise, they were in Wallace and other Idaho towns, but they were written about in glowing terms, if you will, by historians, early on historians. But these historians, quote unquote, left out some large and I would say key chunks of said business person's personal narrative that would change the person's story. So I'm going to talk about John Broadbent was a jewelry merchant in Boise, and he also was a kind of a real estate man, very rich, early citizen, pioneer, if you will. Ellen Bush, later on, 1890s, 1900s, her husband dies. She gets a lot of his money. Jackpot, back in the day for a woman.
Yes.
Her father was Milton Kelly, Judge Milton Kelly.
And he was the editor of the Statesman.
Editor of the Statesman, yes. He knowingly rented properties to, prostitutes as well.
Was he an actual judge or was he an attorney? Because many times they just called attorneys judges back then.
Well, crap, Jeff, I just don't know.
Oh, interesting.
That's a good question, though.
I'm going to have to think about that one.
I'm just going to say he was a judge, and let's just call that the God's honest truth.
All right.
But I don't know, actually. But Ellen Bush did not help the women that lived in her buildings. She profited off of them, ruthlessly.
As you do.
Yeah, any good, capitalist will do back in the day. But anyway, I want to read this to you, peoples.
Read it.
This is from Necessary Evil. It was that great thesis by Joanne Russell. Rest in peace, Joanne. But this is a good one. The grand jury convened to investigate the problems of prostitution in Boise. This is in 1909. But they were investigating prostitution in Boise along with several other matters. 6 madams, 4 house girls, and 2 crib girls, all residing in Levy's Alley, we'll get to that, were questioned. The madams had been running their houses from 4 to 10 years. The parlor houses were all leased, and the women paid $75 to $200 per month on rent for these month-to-month leases. Ellen Bush, John Broadbent, and Max Littman owned the properties. Agnes Bush, a madam, rented a parlor house and 12 cribs. 7 cribs were from Broadbent. 5 from Ellen Bush. 1 crib girl rented from Charles Granholm, and that crib was located at the back of Granholm's saloon. Attorney H.Z. Johnson and Charles Kingsley collected the rent from Broadbent. All of the madams paid $30 per month fines to the chief of police, B.F. Francis. The crib girls paid $10 per month to Francis. Each prostitute paid $1.50 every 2 weeks to a Dr. Stewart, the city physician, for medical exams, because they had to clear and have a card every 2 weeks to practice. So at least he had that going on.
Yeah.
And madams paid $25 per year to the Internal Revenue Service for liquor licenses. The feds must collect, no matter how shady.
Of course, yeah.
Jeff, I think this is a great time to talk about a story you wrote. You have a story to tell about a pimp, a male madam, if you will. And he was basically an organized crime boss of 1910's Boise. It really speaks, this story, to the system of vice that proliferated in Boise and was reflective of other towns as well. Oh, and officials and police, let's just say, the Starling Hotel at 722 and a half Main. Wasn't that it?
Yep.
Well, so in 1917, before we get on to this, there was a Beat Cops journal that I ran across at the Idaho State Archives, and it was just a little handheld, you could find today, just a little lined piece of paper inside a little notebook. But he was writing down what happened to him on his, nightly rounds. He saw a city councilman and the police chief in 1917, maybe this was Francis, I forget the name, but walk into the Starling, stay there all night until 5 a.m. when he had to write them a ticket for a noise violation because the player piano was too loud. That's why, folks, we like to go to the primary documents. They're all out there. You can find them. It just takes a bit of brain work.
Yep, a little digging.
Yep.
So yeah, the Starling Hotel is an interesting place. For years, it was a brothel, obviously. But Mark, you were just talking about the kind of police corruption that was going on during this time. Back in 1913, so just a few years before that, there was a huge scandal which erupted in the Boise Police Department. Basically, the cops weren't doing anything to stop prostitution in the city. So apparently they were engaging in it.
Yeah.
During the whole investigation by the city council into this matter, they kept hearing a name, and this name, or I guess a nickname, I would say. And this nickname was King of the Tenderloin, which, we talked about the Tenderloin being another name for the red light district, or, the area where all the brothels were.
I want steak right now for some reason.
Right? So,
where's the beef?
There were a couple of high-ranking members of the Boise Police Department that were wrapped up in this whole scandal. I think a detective captain actually lost his job over this whole thing. He was being influenced by, like I said, the King of the Tenderloin, who his name ended up coming out, and his name was Doc Sheehan.
It wasn't Dave Thomas?
It wasn't Dave, the Wendy's guy?
Got Burger King. I don't know.
Anyway, James Adrian Sheehan, he was originally from Washington, got basically kicked out of the town that he was grew up in because he was known to play cards and rabble-rouse with the women. Ended up down in Portland, spent some time in the Oregon State Penitentiary before coming to Boise. He became the guy, the pimp, the like I said, the King of the Tenderloin.
Also a founding member of Bob Seger and the Silver Bullet Band. That's just a fact.
He played the guitar.
Rambling, gambling man. Sorry.
So
Listen to Bob lately.
So Sheehan, his whole story is actually in our book called Murder and Mayhem in Boise by, like I said, Mark Iverson and Jeff Wade. Go read it.
Please buy it.
Yes, please buy it. But Sheehan, during this couple-year period, he was actually charged with, I think, 4 or 5 different pretty big crimes. One of them was, running a house of prostitution, a couple of arsons, and then bootlegging.
A dab.
And he ended up going to prison, not for the prostitution or any of the things you think he should have, but he ended up going to prison, which was the old Idaho Penitentiary, on a fraud charge, of all things. So yeah, Sheehan, he ran a lot of the vice and the corruption and the prostitution, stuff like that. Basically, the point of this story is that even though the people of Boise were aware of prostitution and the issues that were going on, the city was either unable or unwilling at the time to fight back against it.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was I'm not saying, nor is Jeff saying, that all police were on the take, but enough were. And, to be fair to the police, especially early on, 1880s, 1890s, before, they didn't really have a budget, and they had to police soldiers who had weapons, and so it was a tough job, and I'm not saying that's the only reason. The higher up on the pay scale you were, I think the less reason you had to be greedy, and but they were more so. So, it was this whole part and parcel. Some might say, hey, for the police to work during the early days, they had to have grafted corruption.
Yeah.
It's a hard job to be a policeman, and a lot of times in the Old West, and in Boise for sure, you didn't always have the law that you were a part of backing you. So it was a dangerous job, and, you weren't paid enough anyway. So sometimes, a little graft probably looked all right.
That's right. So the Starling Hotel where Sheehan ran his businesses out of, it backed up to a place that we call Levy's Alley. Mark, why don't you tell us about Levy's Alley?
It was a special place.
It was very special.
If you all are aware of the Egyptian Theater, I've seen Blade Runner there. That was great. So yeah, if you're at the Egyptian Theater, you basically are watching your movie there, and you would be that building backed up to, before that building was there, what was called Levy's Alley. And Levy's Alley ran from roughly 6th Street between Maine and Idaho, from 6th to 8th. And this was where, after 1884, the Women's Christian Temperance Union started sort of a campaign to push prostitution out. But let's just be honest, a lot of the men that were involved with the WCTU, the wives of the the businessmen, they made money off of this through graft or renting properties or whatnot, or perhaps selling liquor to the trade. But they put it into the alleys, essentially. They ghettoized the vice in the city. And this was named after a man who owned lots of properties on the south end of where City Hall is now. And his name was Davis Levy.
And I think we need to cover his whole story
in another
episode, because his mostly his end, how he died, was crazy. Oh,
for sure. I mean, Davis Levy was a baker, but he was a pimp too. Now, how do you line that up? Hostess, right? Basically, you invent a Twinkie, you get that filling, and then you can also mortar your house with the shit. Davis Levy was one of these type of folks, man. He did it all. And so, he owned all these brothels and tenement houses, in the 1890s, 1900s. But we'll talk about him later, but this, from about 1890 to, I'd say 1910 or so, was the big time for Levy's Alley here. He was choked out and murdered in one of the buildings. They say City Hall is haunted, right? But he was choked out and murdered in one of his buildings in October, where they found him in October 1st of 1901. Choked with packing twine. They say it was personal. But we'll definitely talk about that probably in another episode. There's a lot to go over there. But that's why Levy's Alley was called Levy's Alley. Yep. And so this was where prostitution was legal. And, it was a place that was, what would you say? It was policed.
Yeah.
You had to be, usually the acceptable age was 18 to 21 to go in there. And if you went in there, people knew what you were going there for. It's funny, you look at these old maps that were like, there was the Klondike amusement parlor. You had a shooting range there with all sorts of cool stuff to shoot. You had bowling alleys.
Little ducks and the
little ducks
going by,
yeah. There's a place called like Idaho Print or something next to Goldie's Cafe. That's on the other side, but that was a nudie theater. They would show early porn movie kind of things. It was called the Empress.
So this was definitely the red light district.
This was the red light district.
Like if you wanted to visit a prostitute, this is where you would go.
If you owned a trench coat and loose pants, man, that's where you went, buddy. There were city ordinances in Boise, but they weren't really enforced, right? So these people fed off the soiled doves and made money. The soiled doves didn't make as much money because of these people and could never get out of sexual servitude, essentially. And so they were always kept there, but as we've said, kind of derided for being there. But in 1884, WCTU created an ordinance, wasn't enforced. 1888, 1889, same thing. 1909, all these trials happened where these women were prosecuted, but the shitbirds were left alone, and sometimes they would testify against the prostitutes, which is rich. But let's move on though. We've been talking about Boise quite a bit.
That's right. We do talk about Boise quite a bit, Mark. But you're right. Let's go and move on from Boise. Let's go up north and talk about Wallace. But first, before we do that, why don't we take a quick commercial break? Be right back.
Hey, Jeff, do you have any murder houses with blood dripping down the walls that need sold and need sold quickly?
I might after this weekend.
Fantastic. I have two ladies that are just right for the job. Melissa Call, my friend and fellow Washingtonian, and Kara Harwick, Eagleite from Eagle, Idaho. They've teamed up, and they're a member of Birch Leaf Real Estate out of Eagle, Idaho. And these ladies can sell your home quick, whether somebody's been murdered there or not. To learn more, go to www.birchleafgroup.com or reach Melissa or Kara at 208-254-0490. Jeff, I'm not sure you're aware, but we're in the history business.
Oh, yeah?
The Idaho history business. And we go to lots of historic sites, and we always talk about how best to preserve them. You got any ideas?
One way is 3D scanning, and there's a great company based right here in Boise, Idaho, called Datum Tech Solutions.
Do tell.
Datum Tech Solutions can sell and rent survey equipment and construction technology such as total stations, GPS location tools, drones, and 3D scanners. They also train people how to use them. Mark, these services are used by general contractors, mechanical and plumbing companies, architects, engineers, public safety organizations, and historical societies. So if you want to know more about Datum Tech Solutions, visit their website at datumtechsolutions.com. Hey, Mark, I'm trying to find a book. Do you know any bookstores in this area?
I do, Jeff. Right in downtown Meridian, a soon-to-be a brick-and-mortar store coming in 2023. It's called Pearl House Collective, and it's a woman-owned, independent bookstore featuring big stories from the small presses. We can appreciate that.
Sounds great.
And, Pearl House connects you with dynamic, enriching texts that you'll want to share with your family and friends. And Pearl House hosts the Banned Book Club of Boise, where community members read recently challenged and banned books and discuss them nicely. So join the community online at Pearl House Collective and at Boise Banned Book Club.
All right, and we're back. And why don't we talk about some prostitution in some towns other than Boise? Mark, where are we going next for this?
Let's talk about Wallace.
Let's talk about it.
This was a town where prostitution was kind of in a weird way accepted. And the people there from 1884 all the way up till 1992, and some of them still believe it, the necessary evil bit was like God's honest truth. It worked.
Obviously, Wallace, you'll see news stories once in a while. They make a big deal about going up to Wallace and seeing the brothels, and you can go. I think there's a couple of them that are still you can go walk through and visit and see what the brothels were like back in the day.
Yeah, the Oasis Museum.
Yeah,
it's awesome.
And then I remember seeing recently there was one that was up for sale that you could go buy, and I'm looking at my bank account. I'm maybe not.
You remember we sold one of our children each?
Yes.
And it still wasn't enough.
Not enough. I miss Samuel.
Samuel, come back.
Little Sammy?
Saw those Californians moving up here. They're buying up all the brothels. But yeah, essentially, man, it was the way I hear what you said is Wallace is a wonderful and unusual place. I love it. It's one of my favorite places in Idaho. Not, unfortunately, the sex work is all done. But they have great breweries and a wonderful taco shop.
Honestly, when I was a kid, we went up to Wallace, and I don't remember any of that. But I remember going into the mine. That's one of my clearest memories from being a kid and walking through that mine. And they try to have me do the drill, and I'm I can't even hold this thing. I'm 6 years old.
Yeah, man. Yeah, you were a pansy.
Yep.
Just kidding. I couldn't hold it either.
I still have a core sample from that place.
Oh, somewhere. Sweet. I went with my father-in-law, as an aside, to go up to the Pulaski Tunnel. 1910. I forget the guy's first name, but Pulaski. Ed Pulaski, yeah. That's right. He saved during the 1910 Great Fire up there.
Big burn.
The Big Burn. It was horrible. Mm-hmm. Not to be confused with the Big Burn in prostitution lore. But he saved these guys by putting a wet blanket over an old mining shaft and saving 45 guys.
And supposedly there were some that tried to leave and he pulled a pistol out on them. And
he was like, man, I will cap your ass, fool.
Exactly.
And so he saved these guys. He burnt his hands and his arms, second, third degree burns. This dude was tough as freaking nails. And he created the Pulaski tool that many woodland firefighters use today. Yep. Anyway, this guy was a badass. So there's all sorts of cool stuff going on in Wallace, one of the coolest cemeteries ever. Some of the guys that died, the forest firefighters that died then, are buried up at the Wallace Cemetery. Prostitutes, too. And so it's a wonderful place. Go up there. I see something new every time I go up there. But what I like about it is it's a place where, I guess, traditional understandings of morality are flipped on end. You definitely have, I guess, upright citizens and all that, but the veneer of this morality isn't as applied as thick. So the bullshit isn't quite as thick either. So you had people who really thought that the necessary evil thing worked, and in fact, to some degree, I think it did. Wallace has been referred to as a prostitute town. It was a hard town where miners and loggers worked their asses off, folks. When they got off, they wanted to get off.
They wanted to get off.
They wanted to go. They wanted to drink, gamble, go see a show, and they wanted to go buy time with a prostitute. In fact, in this great book that I read, Selling Sex in the Silver Valley, there's a case to be made with some of the stats that rape and abuse were demonstrated to decline when you do have sex work. And this is not just in Wallace, when you have legalized prostitution. So Wallace showcased, I guess, from 1884 all the way to 1992, that prostitutes were tolerated but also stigmatized. So they were incredibly important, and many people believe that there were less sex crimes because of them. And many of them saw that they served an important societal purpose. They were essentially a safety valve offering those services while indicating the activities of inherent deviance. And so it was a very topsy-turvy kind of, role to play in history.
That's an interesting point to make, is that at some level, men, I don't know if I want to get into this too much, but men kind of need that outlet, or at least they will blame a lot of their issues on not being able to access sex.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very basic need. We try to hide in the shadows, but dude's got to do it.
I guess so. But on the regular in Wallace, there were usually about a dozen different cat houses that were open in the town. From 1884 until 1903, those houses were on Pine Street, which was between 5th and 6th Street. And as Dr. Heather Brandstetter wrote, by 1905, most of the women had been forced to migrate to an official redistricted district on Block 23, the triangular patch of land where the Depot Museum is located today. So if you were to Google Wallace, Idaho, you usually see a picture of that train depot. So that's where the red light district of Wallace was.
Right where the train goes in the tunnel. Just kidding.
It's perfect. Later on, I'll talk about Napa and how good or how accessible that was, being next to the train depot.
I'm all ears, man.
All right.
It's right where they get off the train, those businessmen.
You keep saying get off.
Yeah. God, this is just full of jokes, man. We don't even mean to, but, so like most earlier towns of Idaho, but like 20 years later on, so we're talking 1884, right? Instead of 1863, 64. So Wallace was like most other towns, but it just started 20 years later, right? In that development process. Whereas rustic brothels, prostitutes working on their own, led to, more regulated, societally defined and patterned prostitutes and brothels. And so when sex is swept under the rug, chastity belts made of iron or thick leather were applied to thy groinal region. So when you had earlier times, the frontier times, brothel women ran more of the show, they ran more of the show. But after 1905, as Jeff was saying, block 23 in Wallace, the men that owned those properties really kind of, and the saloons really ran the show after that point. They could define what terms these brothels and women worked under.
So, Mark, what you're saying is that in Wallace you had a situation before 1905 where ladies could operate or work pretty much wherever they wanted to throughout the town. But after that law was passed, it kind of forced them into this little area, and those buildings and businesses were ran by men who were then in control of what they were doing.
Yeah, essentially, you might have a madame, but the building was owned by a man, property owner, and then they
took a cut.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so that less got to the actual woman having the sex that she did not probably want to have, but had to do, to make ends meet.
So basically, we're just creating more rigid rules for women, whether they're acceptable or not.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's one of those things where, in Wallace civilization and its laws, where civilization got in, there were more rigid rules. But in Wallace, where civilization came in, they were filtered, basically, or kept at bay by that local system, that local society, the officials, the cops. They filtered the rules from the feds that said, no prostitution or only by these terms, but later on, no prostitution, right? We feel like we are less conservative, I guess, today, but in fact, in some ways we aren't. But these local police and officials' politics, they disregarded some of these federal laws that they found nonsensical. Because really, government on the locals what affects you the most. And they understood that people got a screw, man. It's a fact of life, buddy.
I find taxes nonsensical.
Oh, yeah. So a lot of them, for sure. But, that's my own opinion.
Yeah.
But, even in the best of circumstances, life was violent. So there's a story from October of 1890 where Lulu Demont stabbed her coworker, Frankie Dunbar, 7 times with a stiletto that she hid in, like a ribbon. That's nasty, dude, right?
Ouch.
Pulls out this long little narrow piece of metal and then stabbed her 7 times. And the fight occurred outside on the corner of 5th and Pine Streets. And this was after a night of working at the Star, which was a boarding house, but a parlor house. It was one of the upper class establishments.
Yeah, I've heard of that. There's a lady named Gracie Edwards who was the proprietor. So here's a quote about the Star. The Star catered to a more elite clientele. Edwards emulated larger city parlor houses by furnishing the brothel with lavish fixtures. Her, quote, girls entertained customers in an environment of relaxed luxury. After midnight dinners, wine from crystal goblets and satin spreads and pillow shams. I hate pillow shams.
It's all about the shams, man.
On the beds indicated that Edwards knew from experience upper-class brothel patrons required. So this is a classy joint.
This is a classy joint, but man, every time I return to Wallace, I find new things that I failed to notice before. It's just such a great, well-preserved town. All around it are cool things up in the canyons, these old mining towns. We'll talk about it during the mining wars, and we talk about the Buffalo Soldiers that were sent in there. After reading Selling Sex in the Silver Valley, it's a tremendous book. I need to return and check it out again, but I want to read a passage that was put in there. And this is basically, it's about cribs, and there's a guy named Richard Magnuson that lived up there, and the author, Dr. Heather Brandstetter of Selling Sex in the Silver Valley, interviewed this guy, and he said about what's left in Wallace from the old prostitute days. There are remnants from the old cribs in the alley behind what used to be the U&I. What's the U&I? I gotta find that out.
Interesting.
But around the back and to the east of where the Oasis Bordel Museum is now. Back there you can see a small door window pattern, which was how the cribs were structured. They were little one-room places with just a door, a window, and a bed. That whole alley used to be lined with cribs, and the women would pay their rent by the day or week to the saloon keeps. The alley had a gate across it, which you can see in the old pictures taken looking east. My father and his brother used to sell newspapers and would fight for who got to sell on the corner by the gate because the tips were the best there. Back in those days, there were all sorts of newspapers, including ethnic ones from all countries like Sweden. The cribs are now in disrepair. They're gone. But one might still have a doorbell if you look closely. Like these things are still there in town. They're in Boise. They're in Nampa. Jeff knows of them. You just got to know what to look at and where the remnants are. And, you have these old buildings that are now named something different, but were once the Star, these high-class establishments. And so these remnants, these ghosts of a bygone age are all around us in Idaho.
Wow, that's crazy. And you can really see that there's a functioning system of vice that flourished there in Wallace.
Yeah, man. And the economy adapted as times changed, which I like. So that system changed from time to time when it needed. When more rules were applied, madams and saloon men adapted. When prostitution was illegal in saloons, they created dance halls or these disreputable theaters, box buildings where you took a man into a box and solicited him for maybe elsewhere, but the system prevailed.
Yeah, we're gonna have to go up there to check out that Oasis Museum, which is an old brothel, no less.
It's not working anymore, Jeff. Don't get so excited.
Oh, dang it. When they shut it down in the late 1980s, they kept it as it was, as, all the furnishings and stuff, so it's pretty cool.
Yeah, man. We do got to go up there. I love that place. I got to stay in one of the old haunted hotels / brothels. In fact, one thing that I read about the Oasis, I didn't add to what we're going to talk about, but man, so if somebody died at one of the brothels in that, Block 23 area, they would take the body discreetly over to a hotel across the street, wherein they had a deal with the manager that they would lay this patron on a bed there, and he would be found by the authorities as having died at an actual hotel. Oh, they're saved. Okay. The patron is given a little respect, right. And such an interesting little things that are hard to find out if you're not an actual person involved in all that, right?
So what you're saying is when we find death records, maybe not always trust where it says they died. Because I can actually think of a case in Boise where a, quote, inmate from the old soldiers' home visited some ladies of the night.
Oh, that's right.
They took off to Nampa in a car, and during this whole debauch, crazy weekend they had, he ended up dying. And then they took him back to Boise, but the death records show that he died at was it the Manitou Hotel?
Yeah. Down by, like across down Main Street between 9th and 10th.
Yeah.
Or no, 10th and 11th, where the Manitou is. There's the banquet. Or no, the bouquet.
Yeah. Down
there, the gym building. Yeah.
So I almost wondered if he didn't die at the hotel.
But I think he wanted to, man. He wanted to go out partying. Exactly. That's what I think.
Yeah, because he was an old veteran, and
yeah. Man, he earned it.
Man, I love that story. We got to do that story.
Yeah. That's a long one, right? But we got to do it.
Yeah, we got to do it.
So, returning to Boise, Nampa, and Nettie Bowen, that badass. She was given a lot of shit, but she took none of it. She accepted none of it. Back in June of 1890, before she stabbed Jimmy Turner, because she was like, "You ain't gonna beat me again." She had already been, some say pistol whipped, some say hit, and definitely thrown from a restaurant / boarding house in Nampa. She had shot a man, and his name was James Anderson, and he owned a restaurant in Nampa. And he had thrown her out of a building because he said she was being lurid or rude at 9:30 at night.
Regarding a beefsteak.
Exactly. She's like, "What are you serving me this crap for? I live here. I pay room and board. I bring people here. What are you doing?" But other women, there was this whole trial because she shot him because he hit her. She came back. This happened. So he threw her from the stoop at about 6:30. She went out, got a gun, came back 3 hours later. So she thought it over. And she comes back and she shoots him. But it hit some sort of object, metallic object, right? In his pocket.
Yeah.
and he doesn't get shot or die. He gets shot, but
he's slightly injured, basically.
Yeah. And this happened to this boarding house restaurant of his. And so, definitely something happened. He says that she was very rude, and let's see if I can make sense of this. Is from the trial and testimony, but James Anderson said, I said, Miss Bowen, you will use better language or go out. So he said, James Anderson said that basically he tried to get her to politely leave, but she wouldn't. Now, this is trial testimony, and this is what he said happened. But essentially, he goes on to say that Nettie declared.
So, okay, so he said, I said to Miss Bowen, you will have to use better language or go out. She said, you are mistaken, you son of a bitch. I am not Miss Bowen. I am Nettie. If any cock-sucking son of a bitch that would send me such a steak as that ought to have a cock to suck as long as my arm, I would not give such a steak to my dog. So.
Yeah, man. She got up from the table, and she threw the steak down. And so anyway, he goes on to claim that she continued to use profanity and be vulgar, and so he threw her out on the street, but he didn't hit her. Now, all the women, the working ladies, said that he, in fact, struck her and threw her off the 2 to 3 foot stoop.
Ouch.
Yeah. And she landed on her shoulder. She was kind of hurt, and you know what? Her pride was hurt. I would imagine it'd get pretty hard to be messed with all the time and treated that way.
I think you deserve to be shot.
Yeah, right. You did that to me, sucker. But she came back 3 hours later, so she definitely thought this over. Yeah. Premeditated for sure. Yeah. But you know what? She shot this guy, and he lived.
Yeah, lived to tell about it.
She was accused of or charged with battery with a deadly weapon or something, or intent to commit murder. But she got off with a fine in a little time.
Obviously not the best shot in the world.
Yeah, right. But good for her, man.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I can see like this guy's like, I'm running an establishment. That's the hard part. You can only get what's left. Right? Yeah. Even if you have all these sources from papers and testimony, you never get the full emotion and truth of the situation.
Yeah.
You can only surmise. And that's the thing. I guess I can see it from both avenues. Hey, right. Lady, don't use this horrible language at my establishment. But she's like, well, I bring a lot of money here and all the time, and you serve crappy food endlessly to me and my ladies.
Yeah.
So guess what? I'm going to complain. And that's what happens.
Yep. She went right to the complaint department on that one.
Damn straight.
Can I talk to your manager?
And if not, I have something for you.
So yeah, Mark, I think we've really illustrated that life was tough for these women, and we really only scratched the surface. And like you said at the top of the episode, we're going to be doing probably more in-depth dives into some of these ladies' stories as we kind of go on.
Yeah, really, we've just really, it's just the tip.
Just the tip.
Really.
Yep.
We've only touched the tip of the iceberg, really, and, it's not easy to surmise the real from the not so real, but not all of them were harlots with the heart of gold that would take care of people, in the tough times, although some did. Like, there's the famous Madame Mustache not Madame Mustache, I talked about her, sorry, Molly Be Damned.
Yep. Up
in Wardner and the Wallace area. She was definitely that way, but she died horribly.
Yes.
And then there were vile women of fallen virtue that were, scarred by what had happened to them. But most of them, they're just humans. They're humans, and they're in a tough situation. They weren't, born to money. They got to do what they got to do. They couldn't find a job, especially out west. So it was a man's world designed that way. And so these women did what they had to do when they didn't have a husband, or their husband had died, or they were destitute. They became prostitutes. And I respect them way more than the morality police of any day or age. So basically, I say to these morality police of any time and place, chickadee check yourself before you riggedy wreck yourself, you know?
Exactly. Mark, did you want to talk about Nampa a little bit before we wrap this up?
Yeah, man.
So Nampa, I did quite a bit of research into the red light district of Nampa when I was working on my macabre history of a Nampa walking tour, and I found some interesting stuff. So if anyone knows Nampa, if you've been to Nampa, especially downtown Nampa, you know about the Nampa train depot. It's right there downtown, train tracks right there. Across from the depot, you have several original buildings. Some of the first buildings that were built in Nampa are still standing, especially if you're looking up 12th Avenue. On the right side of the street, there's, I'm pretty sure those buildings go back to late 1890s, right? So those buildings on the right side were actually brothels. They were brothels all the way from basically the time Nampa started. And these, if you look at the old Sanborn fire maps, they're listed as, what did we say earlier? They were
female boarding
or boarding houses,
hotels,
anything like that. I mean, kind of a dead giveaway. But these were
seamstress.
So weird. But these were brothels all the way up until the 1940s on that side of the street. And if you think about how convenient they were, you get off the train, you have your saloons on the bottom, your brothels on the top, and you had a couple of these ladies, like we talked about. Nettie Bowen was a pretty interesting character. She's not the only one that I found a good story on, Mark. You talked kind of about suicide and that issue surrounding prostitution. There's one lady that I like to talk about on my tour. Her name was Grace Davis. Grace was a young lady. She had plied her trade in Boise before she came out to Nampa. We're talking about 1906, actually December 14th, 1906. Grace was living and working in one of these boarding houses right there in downtown Nampa. She had one of her favorite clients come visit her along with a couple of his buddies, and they started partying, rabble-rousing till all hours of the night. They actually the men missed their train. They were supposed to move on in the evening, but they decided to wait until morning because they were obviously drunk and, couldn't really make it to the train station anyway. So they kept drinking, and at some point during that night, one of the guys pulled out a little pistol. And the thing was, Grace, she saw this pistol, so she grabbed it from the guy and she started messing around with it. And she looks at what they call her favorite client, and she points it at him. She says to him, "How would you like a bullet through you?" And just as she says that, the gun discharges. When you're with a prostitute, you don't want an accidental discharge, right? Last thing you want. So you actually told me that joke first, Mark.
But often the first thing that happens.
Yes, thank you. So the bullet actually strikes the man in the abdomen, and Grace, thinking that she just killed this guy, takes the gun and walks into another room. All of his friends are trying to, obviously help him, so they don't really notice that Grace walks into the other room with that gun. She walks in there, puts that gun to her head, pulls the trigger, dies right there.
And the building's still there, you say?
So I can't trace exactly which building it was, but It was one that was down there. I like to tell the story because it really highlights the plight these women had, because Grace Davis, I'm about 95% sure that was not her real name. Often these ladies would use assumed or fake names when working as a prostitute. She also didn't have any family to speak of. There was one article saying that she might have had some family in Denver. Her mom was in Denver, but I can't find a burial record either in this area, Nampa, Boise area, or in the Denver area, showing a Grace Davis, or anywhere actually in the United States, through like services like Find a Grave or Billion Graves. I can't find anything saying that she was buried under the name Grace Davis. So I don't know if, like we talked about earlier, they just buried her in an unmarked grave here locally, or if maybe they eventually did find a family member, and because that wasn't her real name, the burial record doesn't reflect that name, Grace Davis.
Yeah, it's often hard to find, if you find an article saying this prostitute has died, it's hard to find their burials.
And again, it's almost like they weren't thought of as real people.
Yeah, they weren't. I mean, they were shadow people to acceptable society. Keep out of the way. There's one story I like to tell, although I like to admit a mistake. I said this suicide of a woman named Molly Lacey happened at a parlor at 444 Idaho. But I was telling people, 444 Idaho had to be around here by the Flying M, coffee shop building, the Chan Lee, which was itself a brothel, Davis Levy's brothel in 1891. But anyway, so Molly was at 444 Idaho, this article said. I come to find out, thanks to Angie at the archives, Angie Davis, that 444, through her research, was actually a euphemism, a code word for a parlor house.
Oh, so it wasn't the actual address.
It wasn't the actual address.
Oh, okay.
Which is why I was like, where the fuck is this thing? It's supposed to be right here. So Molly was at this parlor house, and it was, she had come into town in 1884. She worked at a merchant's shop. There's not a lot, but one can surmise that perhaps she wasn't making enough. Something happened. I don't know. But in 1885, she's at this brothel where men would come in, and this was a brothel where they would have toga parties.
This was one of those upscale
places. And we know a lot about it because... Yeah, exactly. We know a lot about it because James Hawley Jr., the son of the famous lawyer and then mayor and I think governor
yeah.
James Hawley, he was a paper boy in the red light district, and he would go here and he would deliver a paper, he would hide, and the madame would pull him out by the ear. Might have been Nettie Bone because she was a madame in that area. But this Molly Lacey was at one of these parlor houses, and she was generally spoken of as a happy-go-lucky girl, but this story highlights how the Statesman and other papers would write about these women. When a rich woman died or an acceptable woman died, they were very, empathetic and all these things. Of Molly, they would say basically, well, she was feeling despondent. One of her working sisters, frail sisters, went into the other room, but were worried about her. They didn't know she had a pistol, and she shot herself in the brain. And they report the aftermath, whereas essentially this chunk of her skull, 4 inches long, 2 inches wide, was blown off of her head and broke the mirror in the room. And what a shame that was. And this is how they talk about women. They're like, yeah, they're people, it's a shame, but they're prostitutes kind of way.
Well, we have to buy a new mirror.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right? And so whenever, or Alice Durant, right? Where City Hall is her husband, was her pimp and whatever, small time outfit, drank carbolic acid.
Well, he also the dishwasher or the cook or something too.
Yeah, exactly. Right? He was like he was like one of these lame dudes, I don't know, just whatever. Yeah. But they would call these lovers, these pimps that were also their lovers, right? And they would totally... But she basically came down. She was drunk after or during a night of working. He called her out, embarrassed her in front of people. She comes back down after going upstairs again with what looked like a shot glass, essentially, a drink. And she cheers him, and it was carbolic acid. She drinks it, she falls down, dies. This is right where City Hall HR is again. And I actually knew a janitor that said that place is haunted, and he was like, man, I saw a head at night. And I was like, dude, what? He's like, it was just a lady's head floating down the hallway. He's like, I'm never working there again. Wow. At night. And he changed his shift. But that's where,
thought it was time to head out.
Heads or tails, I'll take that. But so she commits suicide there. She's buried up at Morris Hill Cemetery, but that's also where the tale of the lady of the Blue Lady of
the
Midway Saloon, which was on the southwest corner of where City Hall is now. Yep. But anyway, so that's how they reported Molly Lacey, and they were very lured about what happened to Durant, and it was just a different way people looked at you. And the same thing in Nampa or anywhere.
Yep. throughout the West,
throughout
the world.
We had women that were imprisoned at the old 1920s women's ward at the old pen, abortionists, women who had, sex with people perhaps unknowing but transmitted VD. It was just a desperate world. I say stay out of my pants, federal government, state government. It's a harsh world, but it's not always quite what you think. But we'll probably do more episodes on this. In fact, we will eventually.
I think so. All right. I think we're running pretty long here, Mark. So why don't we go and sign this one off and come back next week.
Namaste, Jeff.
If you want to get a hold of us, send an email to info@idahistory.com. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Ida History. You can visit us on the web at idahistory.com. Ida History would like to thank our listeners, sponsors, and contributors. If you want to know how you can become a contributor, go to idahistory.com/podcast. Please consider giving us a rating and review on your podcast app. I'm Tom Hart, and this is Devil's County.